Good afternoon. Hi, everyone. I see a class of, looks like middle schoolers I'm looking at. Hi, my name's Carol Willis, and I am part of this project that we're bringing to you, the Presidential Primary Sources Project. We are glad to have you with us today. I'm going to just tell you very briefly about this project if you're not familiar with it, and also, as I said, give you a brief summary and then introduce our guest speaker for today, who is Mark Adams with the Truman Presidential Library. I'm going to switch over so you can see my PowerPoint. Hold just a second. Okay. So what is the President Primary Sources Project? Well, it's a project, and there's a whole group of us trying to pull this project together for the year. So it's going to consist of collaborators. There's several of us in multiple states, as well as multiple national parks and presidential libraries that are participating in this year's conference. So I hope y'all will remember this, because we will repeat an opportunity next year, pick a different theme, a different topic, and hopefully have additional content providers. But anyway, just wanted you to see who all is participating in this year's conference project. So last week we had a presentation from the George Bush Presidential Library. Today, as you know, you're connecting to hear the Harry S. Truman Library talk about the Cold War crisis and what was happening in order to protect democracy.
Welcome to Unified Conferencing.
We got somebody joining us. That's great. Following this presentation, after Thanksgiving, we'll have a presentation by Theodore Roosevelt Center, and then presentations in December by Mount Rushmore, Valley Forge National Park, and the Jimmy Carter National Historic Site. As I mentioned, there's a bunch of us participating in this project, and you have states such as Texas, Ohio, Idaho, North Dakota, and Pennsylvania that are collaborating together to bring you this presentation. I will be introducing Mark Adams in just a moment, and I'm going to switch back to myself, so give me just a second. Oh, I see we have the Jimmy Carter Museum that's joining us for this afternoon's presentation as well. Before we begin, and I ask Mr. Adams to present his great information, I know we have multiple schools connected this afternoon, so I'm going to ask if you are in the Eastern time zone, so if it is 3 o'clock there at your school, would you unmute your mic and tell us your school and where you're located? Anybody in the Eastern time zone? I thought I saw, let's see, well, maybe they're not in the Eastern time zone. Cambridge, maybe they're not. How about Central Time Zone? I know we have a couple of schools from the Central Time Zone. If you want to unmute your mic, say hello, give the name of your school and what city you're in.
We're Del Valle High School, and I'm Dylan Lewis, and this is...
Odalys Sanchez.
Great. Hello, Del Valle. They are in right outside of Austin, Texas. I think we have another school in Corpus Christi. Are you there? Maybe they're being shy. Is there anyone else that would like to unmute their mic and say hello? Okay. Y'all are being shy. I know you're out there. Just so you'll know, Mr. Adams is going to be showing some primary source documents on the screen, and it may be a little hard for you to read. So I recommend you get either a PC or some other monitor so you can actually see it a little bit closer if you have one handy. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Adams. And Del Valle, if you don't mind, go ahead and speak again and welcome him so that they will see you so he will see you on screen and not me. It's good for him to see kids on screen. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Mr. Adams.
Good afternoon, Del Valle. You guys are just outside of Austin, is that right?
Yes, sir.
All right, well, I'm going to have you mute your microphone now, and then I'm going to call on you for some questions a little bit later on, okay?
Yes, sir, that sounds fine.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and begin. First of all, welcome. I'm at the Truman Library, which is in Independence, Missouri, home of Harry Truman. And we're about 20 miles east of Kansas City, so in the western part of Missouri. And we're about 4 hours west of St. Louis. So that's kind of geographically where we are, pretty much directly north on I-35 from Austin, just probably about a 12-hour drive, I would say. So, and I know there in Austin you have the Johnson Library there at the campus of University of Texas, Austin. And we're right here in the heart of Independence, just about 4 blocks north of the Truman home, where President Truman and Mrs. Truman lived from about 1919 until Truman's death in 1972. What we're going to do today is look at one of the first Cold War crises after World War II. I'm going to start with this dramatic newspaper heading. Let me see if I can line it up for the camera. And we're going back to 1945 and the end of World War II. I'm going to peek over the top of the newspaper here, so you can see the headline. And coincidentally, when the Germans surrendered to the Soviet Union and to the United States at the end of World War II, the day was commemorated as VE Day, or Victory in Europe Day, and that was May 8th, 1945. So that kind of gives you a point in time that we're dealing with. It just so happens that Truman, who'd been president only for about 3 weeks, May 8th was actually his birthday. So it's kind of a nice birthday present for him. The Germans surrendered, and you have Germany really carved into with the Western powers, United States, France, and Great Britain on the west side of Germany, and then the Soviets on the east side. So I'm going to put that newspaper down. What I'm going to do this afternoon is give you a little bit of background to the situation in Germany post-World War II from 1945, leading up to the crisis of 1948, and to the point where the Soviet Union actually blockades Berlin from the Allies so they can't get access to it. And we're going to be looking at that. It's kind of a case study in the earliest conflicts of the Cold War, but in our theme of global democracy, also how the United States and Great Britain tried to protect the democracy in West Berlin. So I'm going to switch to a very short PowerPoint, probably 5 or 6 minutes, to give you some background, and then we're going to look at some primary source documents to give you some insight into the kind of correspondence and materials President Truman had to deal with when he was trying to wrestle with this crisis. Give me 1 second here. With the magic of the remote, we're going to switch to the computer. So you should be able to see a PowerPoint there with Stalin on the left, with his hand on his chin and the pipe in his mouth around a chess table, and then President Truman on the near side, on the right side, with a bow tie and holding a chess piece in his hand. What I'm going to do here is just kind of advance forward and give you some background information about how Germany was divided up. As I mentioned, you had the Allied forces of the United States, Great Britain, and France coming in from the west, the Soviet forces coming up for the east. And you can see on the map there on the right how the eastern part of Germany in yellow is controlled by the Soviets, and then the green, the orange, and the pink are the Western allies, Britain, France, and the United States. So that's how Germany was divided up at the end of the war in 1945. If you think about the political structure that those countries followed, the US, the British, and the French were really much more of a Western capitalism, and the Soviet Union ideology was communist. And it wasn't long before those two ideologies faced off against each other and became kind of the root of the Cold War, those differing political ideologies. As Britain and France had suffered quite strongly in World War II, it became very clear that the leading power of those allies was the United States, and they became, the global superpower of the West, and then the Soviet Union, the global superpower of the East. Now remember, during World War II, they were allies and they fought on the same side against the Germans, but it didn't take long for those two sides to become enemies themselves once the war ended, as the two countries tried to really divide up the rest of the world. You can see a closer up view of Germany there and the way the zones were created of Germany. So you have the British flag, the French flag, the American flag, and the Soviet flag, showing how Germany was divided. One thing I want to point out to you on that map on the right is where Berlin is on the map. Berlin is a long way into the Soviet zone. And so to get access to that city from the Western zones was quite a distance for them to travel. By July of 1948, as we will see, that Berlin is blocked off from the British, the French, and the Americans. So we're going to look at why that happened and what Truman wanted to do about it to try and solve the crisis. And you can see the same map there again, and some information about the types of areas those zones were made up of. Now Berlin itself, as I said, deep in the heart of the Soviet zone, was also divided. So not only did you have a country divided, you also had a city divided as well into 4 zones. And you can see how the city was divided, not equally. You can see the Soviet zone is much larger than the other 4 zones, the other 3 zones. One reason for that is the Soviet troops had arrived there first in Berlin, forcing the German surrender. But you can see the French zone in the blue at the top, the British zone in the gray, and in the light blue, the American zone. That's West Berlin. And there's a close-up that you can see those sectors with some of the geographical features such as the river. As you'll see over time, the French, the British, and the American zones all become joined together in one zone, and even combined, they would still be smaller than the Soviet sector on the east. So you can see that the Soviets did have more territory on the east side of Berlin. The way in and out of Berlin, you can see again where this is the whole map of Germany. And you can see where Berlin is situated way inside the red zone there, appropriate color for the Soviet Union. So to get there from the British and French and American zones, you could go by plane, and it shows the air corridors there on that map. Go by rail, go by canal, which is popular, and also by road. But it was quite a distance way inside the Soviet zone. By July 48, as I mentioned, the Soviets blocked off the travel by rail, canal, and road. The only one left was by air. So you might be thinking, well, why did they do that? One of the reasons was the Allied countries, America, Britain, and France, had wanted to combine their three zones into one. They called it Trizonia, to try and help with the recovery. Instead of having 3 separate economies, to try and combine the 3 together to build more stable. The Soviets opposed to that. The Soviets opposed any kind of attempts at combining zones and making a unified Germany. They wanted Germany to remain divided and to remain split, as they were wary of a recovering German threat in the future. The Allied zones also wanted a unified currency, so they had the same currency in all of their zones. And again, the Soviets were opposed to that. They had numerous meetings with the Allied Control Council. That was the group that was in charge of Germany. And in March of 1948, the crisis escalated when the Soviets walked out of the meetings, when these kinds of unification talks reached its peak, the talks of a trizonia and talks of a unified currency. The Soviets opposing that walked out. By June, the Allies went ahead with their plan to merge their three zones together, calling it trizonia, as I mentioned, and to also establish its own currency in June of 1948. As a result of that, the Soviets, no longer wishing to go along with those plans, blockaded the city of Berlin inside of their zone so that the West could not get access to it, as I said, by rail, by canal, and by road. Okay, so what we're going to do here, that's the background information. I'm going to launch a website for you in a second, and we're going to look at some primary source documents. Here at the Truman Library in Independence, we have 16 million primary source documents relating to Truman's presidency. And we have about 30,000 of those online and an additional 30,000 photographs online as well. We're just going to look at 3 or 4 documents today in the time that we have to give you some insight in the kind of information Truman was facing. And I'm going to have you examine these documents. Now, I realize on your computers where you are in your classroom, it may not be the clearest. So if you do have access to another laptop or a handheld device, you can launch the website address that's on the PowerPoint slide, trumanlibrary.org/berlinblockade.htm. I'm going to zoom into these documents as closely as I can so you can read them, but I wanted to give you that alternative to view them from that website address. And you can certainly view them afterwards as well. And there's a whole bunch more that we're not going to get into today. We're going to get into 3 types of documents as it lists on the PowerPoint slide. We're going to look at a CIA report, we're going to look at a State Department telegram, and we're going to look at letters from the general public. So let's go ahead and launch the website. You get going here. That's the website address if you need it, and I can always read it back to you if necessary. We'll give it a second to fire up. Here we go. Whoa. Wait a second. Let me give my computer permission. There we go. This is what the page looks like. I realize it's not that clear from where you are, but we are going to get into looking at it a little clearer here in a second. But I did want to point out the CIA documents are on the left, the State Department telegrams are in the middle, and the public opinion letters are on the right side. We're going to look at one document from June of 1948. And this is a PDF document. We've scanned it and converted it into a PDF, so it's easier to read. And you see right away it says it's top secret document. And then you see a line through that. So it was once top secret. I'm not violating any rules today. This has now been declassified. It's a report from the Central Intelligence Agency, so a very powerful primary source document, and it's titled, The Effect of Soviet Restrictions on the U.S. Position in Berlin. At the bottom we have a date, June 14th, 1948, and then the stamp on the left shows you when it was declassified in the 1970s, so some 30-something years later. And it even says on there, copy number 1 for the President of the United States, because obviously this was circulated to other people. Now, what we're going to get into here is we're just going to look at 2 paragraphs, and I'm going to make this a little larger here in a second. So this, we have a summary, and I'm going to make it a little bit larger, see if this helps. and scroll a little bit so you can read it. It may cut off on the edges. Let me see here. So, what I'd like you to do, if you can open your microphone in Del Valle, and just let me know whether that's readable for you.
Yes, it is.
Okay, now what I'd like you to do is take a look at those two paragraphs. Hang on a second. Take a look at those two paragraphs, and then in about a minute and a half, to give you a chance to read those, and then I want you to report back to me what the summary of this report is saying to President Truman. And in particular, I want you to look at the letters A through E in terms of the result of the Soviet restrictions. So that's in the second paragraph, the letters A through E. So I'm going to give you about a minute to do that, and when you're ready, you can open your mic and you can report back to me what you've found from that document.
Dr. Adams, this is Cambridge. Yep, I was going to ask you if you can scroll it up a little bit. Thank you.
How's that?
Excellent. Thank you.
You're welcome. Glad to have you on board today.
We're glad to be here. Thank you.
When Del Valle is ready, I'm going to have them give a response to what they can glean from this document.
We're just going to go down the list. A was how to handle the loss of Berlin and access to information and stuff like that. B is movement within sectors. C is propaganda and how to get the how to get out of information, get out information. D was commodities, coal and heat, and how they're going to get hot food or heat and food to people. And we couldn't see E.
Yeah, I just scrolled it up for you. Do you want to take a quick look at that one?
How to keep everybody together. And E is how to keep everybody together.
You guys did a great job. This is the third time I've done this today, and that was a great response.
Thank you.
All right, I want to just ask the schools just to temporarily mute their mics while I kind of review some of the information here, and then we'll go to the next document. Just to look at those points A through E, as summarized already by Del Valle, you've got the idea that Berlin as a center of intelligence has been impaired by the fact that the Soviets are restricting access. Any kind of spy network, kind of intelligence being gained, that's been affected. Under B, Germans are not able to move around the city as they could before. And so one of the things the US was trying to do was to encourage anti-communism within the Soviet zone. If you can't move people into that zone, it makes it more difficult to do that. The third one is about US propaganda. They can't really get that word out about what the US stands for and what they're doing there, unless it's by radio. That's the only way, because they can't move around. The fourth one, not only are things difficult to move into the area, but also things that are made in Berlin, they can't ship them out to the West either. And then the fifth one, the ACC and the Kommandantur, that's the government. So they've lost their usefulness in hoping for German unity. And one of the things to remember here is that US and its allies are really pushing for German unity, to unify all the zones together, and the Soviets are trying to stop that, and so that's an area where they feel like they're losing that battle. I'm going to switch from this document. Let me come back to me for a second while I do that. Okay, now you can see me again. And I'm just going to close out of that one document, and we're going to look at a State Department telegram. And this time, we're going to switch to, I heard we had Cambridge on the line, so we're going to have Cambridge look at this one, as Del Valle did the next one. So if Cambridge can unmute their mic and say hi to me, I'll be able to see their faces on the screen.
Say hi. Hello. Hi.
Hi, Cambridge. And you guys are in western Idaho, is that correct?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, kind of central western.
Central West, okay. Very good. Well, what I'm going to switch here in a second. We're going to be looking at a summary of telegrams from the Department of State, and I'm going to switch over to that. It's going to be 2 paragraphs. Once I get it switched over, I'll probably increase the size. I want you to let me know if it's large enough for you. And then you're going to do what the last group did, is to summarize the document back to me. So let me switch modes here. There we go. Let me make it a little larger for you. And then let me explain this document again. This was another one that was top secret. And instead of President Truman seeing every telegram that was sent, the State Department would summarize those for him and then send him a daily summary of telegrams. So here you have and they were on different countries and different issues around the world. So this one related to Germany. And I'm going to point out a couple of names on this, so you understand who the 3 people named in the document. The first sentence talks about an Ambassador Douglas. He was the U.S. ambassador in Germany. Then it mentions a Foreign Minister Bevin. He's a representative of the British government, the British Foreign Minister. And then in the second paragraph, it talks about Ambassador Smith, and he's the U.S. ambassador in Moscow in the Soviet Union. So with that in mind, if you could let me know if you can read that clearly enough, and then if so, go ahead and take a minute to review that and see what information you can bring back here in about a minute or two. And Del Valle, I want you to review it too, and if we have time, we'll come back for your response as well. So Cambridge, can you read that okay?
It's perfect. Thank you. Give us a minute, please.
No problem. Take your time.
Thanks. Hey, we're ready now.
Okay, so do we have a student volunteer?
We do. We have Hasten. He's going to be speaking for us today. Wait for the camera, Hasten. Oh, go ahead. Tell us what you think, Hasten.
All right, so paragraph 1, I believe, is just summarizing the fact that the United States doesn't want to drag any other outside force like the UN into the conversation. They want to keep it low-key, and they also want to work with Russia and try and avoid their differences, separating the communications barrier, which would further the problem rather than fix it. The secondary paragraph is discussing the fact that Russia would attempt to stop any armed movements into Berlin. So the U.S. is looking upon that as a last resort if all else fails, rather than initial idea.
Excellent summary. You did a great job there. Let me just switch. I know I've taken the document off of there, but you did a great job summarizing that. So in that first point, they're talking about whether they can go back and meet with the Soviets and not wanting to drag the UN in. They don't want to blow it out of proportion, make the Soviets look bad, kind of tread lightly. And then in that second paragraph, as you said, they want to they're considering armed convoys, but they realize that might lead to fighting and conflict, and they're trying to avoid that. So they're kind of treading lightly at this point. All right, we're going to switch to another type of document. You guys did a great job summarizing that. Let me switch back to the PowerPoint. And we're going to look at the letters from the public. We hope. Here we go. We're always at the mercy of technology. This particular one is a telegram that was sent to Truman in late June of 1948. Now, I haven't mentioned this to the other groups yet today, but you should realize that 1948 is a presidential election year, and Truman is running for president in 1948. So some of these issues, when he's getting letters from the public, can be very important. You should be able to see this first part of this telegram from June of 1948, June 25th. And I'm going to try and scroll down. The problem with this one is there's a bit of a gap between the page 1 and page 2. So if you'll forgive me, I'm going to read this one just because it's hard to get the page break on the same screen. So it's coming from New York. It's directed to the President of the White House. And it says, Russian efforts to drive Western powers from Berlin are a crucial challenge to American foreign policy. Surrender would deliver to Russian vengeance 2 million Germans who have defied communist totalitarianism. There are disturbing rumors of plans to evacuate Berlin because of Russian blockade against German civilian supplies. Essential supplies, and here's where we scroll, so forgive me, for the German population can be delivered by air and if necessary must be at whatever cost. We urge you to make this country's position unmistakable by declaring that under all circumstances short of war, we will remain in Berlin and maintain supplies for the civilian population. Nothing less can adequately reassure democratic forces in Germany and elsewhere that this country will not desert them. And then it lists some of the people: Alfred Bingham, American Association for a Democratic Germany, Murray Barron, New York County Chairman, and so on. So if I turn first of all to Del Valle, what solution to the crisis is this particular letter saying? How can they supply the population of Berlin? What solution are they offering in this letter? And Del Valle, can you get that from that document? You may have to unmute your mic.
We're going to do everything possible to stop short of war.
Right, and how
We
do
can't.
they suggest they
Please go on.
feed the population?
To provide food.
Yeah, but how are they going to get it there?
Airline.
by air, okay? So that was a solution that they wanted to try. Let me switch back now. That's a great response. So Truman is left with these options. Leaving Berlin completely, abandoning it, population of 2 million, sending in a convoy of trucks with supplies, declaring outright war, negotiate with the Soviets, or temporarily fly in supplies. So they have 5 options there. Leaving Berlin, sending in a convoy of trucks, declaring war, negotiating with the Soviets, and temporarily fly in supplies. I'm going to throw it to Cambridge. What would you do in Cambridge?
The Cambridge kids say what? Which one? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Which one?
Let's say use 5 and then lead to 4. You temporarily fly in supplies to maintain the populace while you attempt to make peace with your enemy.
Great answer. I like that. So temporarily and then try and make peace and negotiate. And am I getting that? Am I summarizing that about right?
Yes.
And then what about in Del Valle? What would you do out of those 5 options?
Well, we would pick number 5.
So temporarily fly in supplies?
Yes, sir.
Good job. Now, one of the things I will let you know that when you get into this a little bit more over the next few weeks, if you wanted to look at some of the documents online, you can see, some of the pros and cons of each of those 5 options. So when you saw the document there about sending in the convoy, and then some cautionary notes there about, well, that might lead to some gunfire, or negotiating with the Soviets and they've already walked out of meetings, things like that. So you can kind of look at those documents in more detail. We just looked at 3 today. But you can imagine President Truman had thousands of those documents every week to look over to try and decide what to do. This was one case where number 5 was the option that they chose, to temporarily fly in supplies. Let me switch back to the PowerPoint so you can get a sense of that. So they temporarily flew in supplies just as a temporary measure. Despite the fact that the military governor in Germany, the American Lucius Clay, wanted to use a convoy. It was actually the British that objected to that. They said no, they were very wary of a World War III, considering the devastation in Britain during World War III. And they were the ones that suggested using an airlift to supply Berlin just to buy time. Like I said, a temporary measure. Truman himself, he met with his staff and said, we're going to stay, we're not going to leave Berlin. He said they wanted to increase the airlift, provide more planes, land more frequently. And in a diary entry, and we have his diary here at the Truman Library in Independence, he's quoted as saying, we'll stay in Berlin come what may. I don't pass the buck, nor do I alibi out of any decision I make. So that famous desk sign there, the buck stops here, that we have on display in our museum. So he's not going to leave. One of the things he also decides to do is he moves B-29 bombers into Germany and British airfields. The B-29 was the plane that was used to drop atomic bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So that was kind of a strong political message to send, to bring those over, to have them ready. It was a temporary measure to begin with. It became the permanent solution. So sometimes presidential decision-making is do something temporary while we figure it out, and then it becomes the decision. So they increased the number of flights. They built new airfields, including Tegel Airport was constructed very quickly in the French sector. 10 million bricks were collected from around Berlin to use to build a runway. 81 earth movers were brought into Berlin to build the airport. They actually cut them up into pieces and shipped them over and then welded them back together when in Berlin. An amazing feat. And then the air corridors, they had one corridor from the British zone, one corridor from the American zone, landing at the 3 airfields in Berlin, and then they flew out the central corridor. They had a plane landing every 3 minutes, each one bringing 10 tons in each plane on average. And so you had planes taking off or landing every 90 seconds, 24 hours a day for 18 months. On average, about 600 planes per day, if you can imagine. They didn't drop the supplies from the sky. They landed on the airfields, unloaded them in about 30 minutes, and then flew back out again with British, American, and French pilots. I'm going to skip through some of this a little bit because we're getting short of time, and I want to make sure we have questions. But you can see there the number of calories people were living on per day, around about 1,000 to 1,500 calories a day. And the Allies wanted to provide 1,700 calories a day for the 2.3 million people living there. Mostly the supplies were of coal and flour to keep the population warm in the winter. We see bottles of milk there. That didn't last very long. The bottles would break, so they started to bring in condensed milk instead. And I'm going to skip through some of this. Okay, so eventually the Soviets gave up and the blockade was ended, or at least they announced the end of it in May of 1949, but they did keep the airlift going until September so they could build up fuel and supplies. Okay. We have about 5 minutes. We have time for questions. Rather than talking over each other, let's see if we have a question from Del Valle, and then we can alternate and take a question from Cambridge and any other school that's on the line too. So a question from Del Valle?
Yes, sir. We would like to ask, if Henry Wallace had been president of the U.S., how would the situation have been handled?
That's a good question. I can't really talk for what he would have thought about it necessarily. But the general public was very much behind supporting the city of Berlin and keeping it from becoming communist. Wallace's position varied quite a bit on foreign policy, so that's something that you know would be speculating and hypothetical. But the general public was very much in favor of protecting the German people who were in favor of a democratic way of life. We're going to switch to Cambridge and see if they have a question.
We have one quick question. Bill has it for you.
Okay, sure.
Come on, Bill, quickly.
All right, so if the Soviets didn't want the United States and the Allies to be flying in supplies and whatnot, why didn't they just shoot the planes down?
Well, the Soviets were also wary about starting a war too. So as it was, the propaganda was anyway, from the U.S. point of view, this was a humanitarian effort. There were no fire being shot by the planes. They weren't dropping bombs. They were bringing in coal, fuel, and it was termed as a humanitarian effort. Whereas if they'd have had armed convoys, trucks, they would have had to have had soldiers on the ground to get them through the blockade. They would have had to break the blockade, whereas the air travel had never actually been restricted. That remained open. So it would have been, the onus would have been on the Soviets to stop a humanitarian effort. So they would have probably lost the public relations war there. So that's a good question, but they were not willing to, and some shots were fired once in a while, but it certainly didn't escalate very much. But that was a great question. Maybe one more question from Cambridge, if you have one.
We are done. We have no more. Thank you, Bill.
All right. Any more questions?
We have a question. Yes, sir. How would President Truman have handled a problem like the one that the U.S. is facing currently in Libya?
lots of hypotheticals today. I think that he would have certainly, Truman was known for making very decisive decisions and not going back on them. I would imagine he probably wouldn't want to put the troops on the ground. I think he might have done something similar to what he did in Korea, and that is engage the United Nations, which is what he did. When the U.S. troops were involved in the Korean War, it was a United Nations force. It was the first time the United Nations was used that way. So if it was the post-Korean War effort, I would imagine he would have engaged the United Nations to try and put in troops that way. And engage. He was very much in favor of the United Nations, so I would imagine he would have tried to work through them rather than independently acting as the United States. He very much wanted to work with allies, which is why you see in this crisis he's working with the British, with the French on a daily basis to do a united effort rather than acting alone. Good question. I think we're just about on time. We have about 1 minute in case you have any more questions. Otherwise, I want to thank you for your participation. Great questions and great analysis of the documents.
Thank you.
We're all out of questions.
Thank you very much.
Thank you from Del Valle.
Thank you. I'm going to turn it back to Carol.
Well, thank you, Mark. I'm glad I wasn't having to answer those questions. You did a great job, and both schools, Cambridge and Del Valle, great job. We will be recording today's, you've done 3 sessions. This one seems to have been the most interactive, so we may end up posting this one. But thank you so much, and please stay tuned and join us for the next presentation on November 27th. Thanks a lot.
Thank you,
Everyone,
Carol, for connecting everybody.
Sure. Bye.
Bye-bye.